Well, to talk more about media coverage of the crisis in Syria, I'm joined by Russ Baker, investigative journalist for WhoWhatWhy.com and author of the book Family of Secrets. There it is on your screen. Welcome, Russ. So would you call U.S. media coverage of what's going on there in Syria biased?
I'd call it a travesty. It's even worse, I think, than the coverage of Libya, if that's possible.
And why do you say that?
Well, you know, at WhoWhatWhy.com, we've been studying these things very, very closely, and we find a complete absence of journalistic due diligence. Essentially, just to give you an example, I'm looking at a piece from the New York Times from today, and they quote extensively from an opposition group talking about how many people have been killed, atrocities, a military massacre of 15 detainees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end it says these accounts could not be independently verified. And that you have to ask the question, well, what is that worth? Certainly, if the Syrian government makes a claim, I think those are treated with real skepticism. And really, it all ought to be treated with skepticism. Also, I would apply a bit of logic to it and ask why the Syrian government would be doing the kinds of things they're saying they're doing, which really only serve to alienate the people on a large scale. That's what they said about Gaddafi, you'll remember, where they claimed that he was giving his troops Viagra and encouraging them to commit mass rape. Media put that out, and of course that turned out to be completely untrue.
And Russ, I do want to point out right now we have a new development. That resolution condemning Syria was just passed. This was expected. We all knew that pretty much everyone was on board with this. Really, the only opponents were China and Russia. I want to ask you how you would contrast how the West, how and why the West condemns the Syrian regime, but kind of turns a blind eye to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. What is behind that?
Well, I mean, I think that's geopolitics. I think all those countries do that. Russia does that. China does it. United States, France, Britain, they all do that. I mean, it's very important to remember that governments make decisions based on so-called national interest. Often it's not even that at all. It's the influence of powerful corporate interests that fund the campaign. So we could keep pulling the camera further and further back to try to see what's really going on in this little tiny stage play we're being presented. But the reality is that that it's not about atrocities. Atrocities has never been the standard. It's about the fact that Bashar Assad represents a particular faction, you might say, in the Arab world that the West would like to see depart.
But Russ, we should point out, you know, there as the death toll rises in Syria, and reports of these violent atrocities do continue to come out that they're being committed there. Is it getting harder to justify letting it go?
Well, you see, again, the problem is that we don't know who's committing these things because they're, you know, by now, if in fact it was the military committing large-scale atrocities, it shouldn't be that hard to establish. A lot of what we're talking about involves, say, for example, sniper fire from buildings where we don't know who's doing the shooting. I think to some extent this reminds me of what I saw in Romania in 1989 when I covered the overthrow there of the dictator Ceausescu, where there was tremendous chaos, and there were all these different factions, professional snipers firing on civilians, but not all necessarily from Ceausescu. It was very, very hard to figure out who was behind that. And I think my point here is that we've got to be deeply, deeply wary. Even those numbers we're being told, even the numbers that Ban Ki-moon asserts, he says that one of his people gives him those numbers. Well, where does she get them? Whenever I've looked at those things and tried to really understand it, it turned out that they came from very, very questionable sources originally.
And oftentimes there are two sides to a story. Why do you think, why is it that the media doesn't really dig deeper into reporting the full picture of what is going on there, and that some of these details are being left out?
Again, I think it's a matter of self-interest, and In general, I mean, the reason I started Who, What, Why is because I just didn't feel that the media in the United States were really very good, that people were taking the kind of risks and showing the kind of courage and independence that needs to be shown in these situations. But the reality is that atrocities are horrible. The reality is that people everywhere ought to have democracy. I'm the biggest advocate of the Syrian people having whatever kind of government they want to have. The concern here is, are we getting accurate information, or is this whole thing being played? I mean, Assad and his government have been there for a long time. They've been brutal for a long time. As you mentioned, the Saudis, the Bahrainis, and other governments have been brutal for a long time. China certainly commits atrocities on a daily basis in Tibet, and we don't see the West doing anything about that. So I really do think there's a double standard, and that's the way the press ought to play it.
And quickly, lastly, just want to ask you how this kind of coverage in the U.S. media is affecting public perception of what is going on in Syria.
Well, ordinary people, we're very busy. We don't have time. We don't have the historical background, the perspective to understand what all of these things mean, to understand that Syria is run by a minority Shiite faction in a predominantly Sunni country, that they're aligned with Iran against Saudi Arabia, that Saudi Arabia faces its own poorly covered revolt in a Shiite oil-raising region. These are the big questions, and these are really the things that the public doesn't hear about, and they need to hear about it, because otherwise what we're experiencing is a tremendous kind of mass migration from one viewpoint to another, purely based on these very deliberate and calculated propaganda campaigns.
Russ, thanks for coming on the show. That was Russ Baker, founder and editor-in-chief of WhoWhatWhy.com.